Origin just one CG reaction. This is plans are doomed to fail. The Battle of Galicia, the Great War, Week 6, by the channel The Great War. While the Germans on the Western Front are very close to reaching Paris, the Eastern Front proves to become a disastrous failure for the Austro-Hungarian forces. Konrad von Hotzendorf overestimated his skills and the strength of his troops. And after his too complicated plan in Galicia failed, the town of Lemberg falls into the hands of the Russians. Meanwhile, the war starts spreading into Asia as Japan is besieging Tsingtao and New Zealand conquers German Samoa. Yeah, see, this is why it became the World War, because Europe controlled lots of colonies around the world. So every colony started to fight each other, right? Every European colony was fighting German colonies, and yeah. So let's watch this one.
September 4th, 1914. After a month of fighting, the nations of Europe now all knew that this was a new type of war, with carnage on a scale never before seen. But the technology and logistics of modern warfare also brought with it a whole slew of unforeseen problems, especially as the war was about to go global and truly become a world war. I'm Indy Nidell, and this is The Great War. Here's how the war looked at the beginning of the week. A Russian army had been spectacularly destroyed by the Germans at Tannenberg. The British and French were retreating to regroup around Paris, the Germans hot on their heels, and the whole world was now telling tales of German and Austrian executions of civilians in occupied territories. Traditional war had always had its fair share of difficulties, right? Transportation, supplies, and communications always seemed to go wrong, and World War I was no exception. But we begin to see that almost anything could screw up the best laid plans on an extraordinary scale. Let's take a look at the war in the East. The Russian army may have just suffered a catastrophic defeat against Germany, but they were doing a lot better against Austria-Hungary. Now, the Russians outnumbered the empire roughly 750,000 to 500,000 in troops and had an even greater advantage in machine guns and artillery. Austria-Hungary, though, had won 2 quick victories over the Russians, but it was all downhill from there. Austrian Chief of Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf was overconfident, and he had a complicated plan to let the Russians in the south advance and then swing around them in the north.
So Russia was having trouble fighting the Germans, but not having trouble fighting the Austro-Hungarians. This, gives us, basically a perspective like how powerful Germans were compared to Austro-Hungarians, right? I mean, obviously, Austro-Hungarians were, allies of German, and war started because of Austro-Hungarian and how they wanted to sack Serbia by using, Archduke's assassination as an excuse. And Germany had their own agendas too, but in the end, Germany was the main powerhouse in that, alliance, because they were the main heavy hitters.
See, Hotzendorf was one of the major Austrian war hawks, dreaming of a glorious empire that stretched down to Africa and even to the Middle East. But in practical terms, it was a terrible general.
Yeah, that's what happened when you read about all the Roman Republic and shit like that, Roman empires and things like that. Oh, Romans had this massive empire, it stretched all the way to Africa. I must have that one too. Man, chill out, those times were different.
He sort of ignored the fact that the Russians were heavily reinforcing in the north, and by September 1st, they began to bear down on Conrad with close to twice as many men as the Austrians had. Russia took Lemberg, one of the largest cities in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, on September the 3rd, and Austria was forced to retreat to the Carpathian foothills. So far this war, Austria-Hungary had been in a constant state of disaster, partly because of overstretch, but partly because of incompetence. This would not change, but there were also totally unforeseen problems, chronic language difficulties being a big one. The Austrian army had soldiers from all the many nations of its empire, Hungarians, Czechs, Bosnians, you name it, and troops from one region would repeatedly attack others of its own army, mistaking them for Russians because of the unfamiliar language. And the
You got to be kidding me. Austro-Hungarian, their diverse languages obviously is causing an issue, right? Yeah, he did say, I forgot that element. Austro-Hungary had lots of different type of, ethnic peoples, right? It's not like Germany, right? It's Austria had Hungarians and Czechs, like he said. Holy shit. So in the battlefield, there was real miscommunication. They were attacking their own people. Russians would be seeing that and think like, oh, this is going to be easy.
Slavic troops would simply desert at times because of being made to fight other Slavs, and sometimes even join the Russian army. There were also the huge open spaces of Eastern Europe. Units would become lost, sometimes for days, and just finding the enemy was a daunting task. Now, Russia had problems of its own, though. Although it had an endless supply of men, it could only afford
Okay, how tall is this guy? Holy shit.
to feed and clothe a fraction of them in an army. So you could avoid the draft for a variety of reasons, like if you were the family's main breadwinner. So in early August, for example, 2 million Russians suddenly got married, which would be funny if the ones who went to war weren't all dying. The problems of modern warfare were also being felt in the West, but in different
Okay, so if you're married and you're breadwinner, you don't have to go to wars. Everybody, 2 million people just got married. Holy shit, that is something, right? It's understandable, right? It's a war was bloody already. There is a, by now people already knew how gruesome the war is, how many people were dying left and right.
ways. The Franco-British retreat had started. British commander John French was considering retreating beyond Paris, though, and when he learned that the last Belgian fortress had fallen to the Germans, he thought of abandoning the whole thing and retreating all the way to Saint-Nazaire on the Atlantic coast. He had nothing but disdain for his allies, especially his opposite number, French General Lanzerac. Now, Commander French said that the French army was the sort of people that he did not wish to continue fighting with.
I think he hated French people because his last name is French and he probably got bullied a lot in the school.
Which is insane. I mean, they were at war. They were allies. But the retreat was managed really well. No big guns were captured, and there was never any danger of being surrounded. Now, part of this was that the French army now had a huge advantage: the French railway system. They could move around troops lots faster than the Germans could follow on foot. And follow on foot they often had to do. The automobile was still a fairly new creation, and most of the thousands of German trucks used broke down this month. The Belgians had, of course, sabotaged their own railways, and it would take weeks for the Germans to get them in order again. The Germans had problems not only with their cars, though, but also big ones with their horses, which were, by this point, dropping dead on the roadside from hunger and exhaustion, but were needed to haul the dreaded German guns. The German armies were following the sweep of the Schlieffen-Plan, but on September 2nd, this changed. Instead of going to the west of Paris, they were now diverted to head east of it. This was because of good defense. One German army was stopped by Lanzerac at Guise and forced to head southeast, and the other had faced strong British support the whole way, and the sweep was abandoned. Lanzerac was a very cautious general, and though he was repeatedly ordered by his superiors to counterattack during the retreat, he wouldn't, saying he wanted to wait until open ground to use his artillery. Eventually, even with Lanzerac's success stopping the German advance, he was removed from command for being too cautious. Now, British Commander French was happy when...
I don't know, man. Maybe he was smart there, right? I mean, you have French and French and British troops there, right? And if you want to come in top easily, you need something like artilleries and things to soften up the enemies, right? So it's an easier battle after that. Otherwise, it goes in any direction. Maybe Germans will win, maybe Allies will win. So maybe he wasn't, far off there, being cautious. But obviously, German chain of command, just quickly attack there, quickly countermeasure, and quickly seize. Quickness is one thing I've noticed throughout history, from World War I even to World War II. Germany quickly trying to take victory is the trend.
Lanzerac was relieved of command, but he was far from happy when Lord Kitchener, British Secretary of State for War himself, had arrived in full Field Marshal dress uniform at the end of August to meet directly with French and tell him to damn well work together with his allies and not simply retreat to safety. The British remained near Paris. The Schlieffen-Plan, as it was conceived, might have been successful if Moltke hadn't diverted...
Yeah, they are like, you short-sighted idiot. All right, we are not doing this for the French, you're doing this for us. If France gets taken over, which one do you think is the next? Britain is way too close.
So many of his troops away. He had pulled troops away to fight the Russians, troops to fight Antwerp, for the fortress of Namur, but, that's war. So as the armies neared Paris, the German armies were now reduced in size to below that of the French and British, and they were much lower in ammunition. Now you can see that this was a bed of roses for nobody at all. And something else we start to see around now. This war was no longer a European land war, but was becoming an actual world war on both land and sea. Japan and Britain had had an alliance since 1902, and in mid-August, Japan demanded that Germany withdraw her warships from Chinese and Japanese waters and hand over the port of Tsingtao. And on August 23rd, Japan declared war on Germany. The Japanese landed 23,000 troops beginning September 2nd for the siege of Tsingtao, which would last all autumn. Kaiser Wilhelm said, "It would shame me more to surrender Tsingtao to the Japanese than Berlin to the Russians."
Man, these Germans at that time, they are fighting everywhere, every side. Holy shit. You require balls, like big, massive steel balls to do that. I mean, look at that. Every front, they are fighting Russians, right? They're fighting, British and French, Belgium. Now they're fighting Japanese overseas. How many troops? I get it, during the Prussian videos from Extra History, right? In that, obviously, I learned that Prussia, then later got unified and became Germany. Prussia used to be a military state, right? There was a saying, right? Prussian military has a state or something like, yeah. So basically, that's a massive military state, right? So it's understandable that they have lots of troops and they're fighting from all front. But still, everywhere, they're fighting everyone.
He said a lot of stuff like that. New Zealand had its first engagement of the war, occupying German Samoa on August 29th to take the radio station there, one of several stations the Germans had in the Pacific. Now, the occupation took place without fighting, but it brought the war to the Pacific. This was not the first seizure of a German colony during the war, though, Togo having surrendered to the British and French 3 days earlier. And for Britain on her home islands, this was a dangerous time. Since the entire professional army had been sent to Belgium, and Germany had plenty of troops available to land in the east of England, there was a prospect of invasion. And with a bit of luck,
Germany still has troops left over.
Invading force might elude the Royal Navy. But on August 28th, at Heligoland, 3 German cruisers were destroyed by the British without a ship sunk, ending the threat. This was the first...
Oh no, we send all our troops in Belgium. What if Germany basically comes to Britain and invade us? Oh, I know, we have a British Navy.
Real naval engagement of the war, and as you all know, was very far from the last. So now, we have an actual world war on 3 continents, which brings with it all of the new problems of modern warfare. And though many of these are still connected with transportation, communications, supplies, and even language, they're on a scale like never before. And just as all problems in war cost lives, we'll see millions die as nations try to get a grip on 20th century warfare. We'll see you next week. Click here to see last week's episode.
Damn, that's just fucked up. Yeah, this is kind of a modern warfare, right? World Wars. I mean, World War I started, and this is a time of the cars and things, right? Communication is different. The new technologies are different. British will eventually introduce tanks. There were grenades were introduced, gas attacks. This is kind of a modern warfare. This is proper big-ass global war, the Great War. And this is the first war that used all these technologies. I mean, what are the chances of that? No smaller wars of the past used this technology because it didn't exist. When this technology became available, that is when the World War happened. So this is happening all around the world at the major scale. And that time, all this technology and weapons are being introduced. So that must be a shock thing. Like, people who are veterans, even they will be like, what the fuck? We don't have any experience in this area. All this technology, we have to adapt now. That is just fucked up. Alright, well, that was Plans Are Doomed to Fail, The Battle of Galicia by the channel The Great War. If you like my reaction, don't like, subscribe. Check out the Rick Sante, there's a link in the description. Check out the cards for places, cards in here. I'll see you next time.